Hello and welcome to Suzi's Book Bag, hosted by me, Suzi Foe. I'm very glamorously dressed today. I mean, I always dress well for Book Bag, but I've a particular reason for looking extremely smart today. I have my Yale book bag ready. We are going to be talking art. We are going to be talking history. We are going to be talking some of the most fabulously glamorous and indeed dangerous images that have ever been committed to canvas. And to talk to me about this is the very wonderful Elizabeth Goldring. Welcome to my book bag.
Thank you, Suzi. It's lovely to be here.
It's cold today, isn't it? I see you're in a jumper rather than anything.
I'm bundled up. I'm not looking nearly as glamorous as you. I love the outfit.
So we are going to be talking about your amazing latest book on Holbein, but this is your third book and I've got the others here and they're nearly breaking my table. So
they are heavy.
It's good for exercise. So I have your amazing debut, which was about Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester. All of these are Yale books and they are sensational, beautiful, desirable things. So there he is, the gorgeous Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester. And that book talks about his love of art, his commissioning of art, and his love of portraits as a kind of early selfie monster. So I put this very heavy book down. And we move on to Nicholas Hilliard. Obviously, the great portrait miniaturist. I think all these books we're going to talk about, they have a kind of Venn diagram, don't they? So Hilliard is very much involved in the story of Robert Dudley. But you've gone to this big beast now. This is what we're going to be talking about, this magnificent book. There she is, Anne of Cleves. An ill-fated portrait in many ways, but this is your wonderful book about Hans Holbein. The younger, isn't he? He's the younger.
Yes, absolutely.
So I kind of wanted to begin by saying, obviously, these books all dovetail, but with Holbein, you've sort of gone further back in time rather than going forward in time. You've leapt back. Why did you think it was the right thing to do?
Well, I think this book is in many ways a full circle project for me. My very first art history publication actually was on Holbein. It was a short article on Christina of Denmark, which was published in the Burlington magazine way back in 2002, which makes me feel very old saying that. And then for most of the next 2 decades, worked on the later Tudor period. So Robert Dudley, Elizabeth I's favorite, and the great collector at the English court in the late 16th century, Nicholas Hilliard, court painter to Elizabeth I and actually James I as well. But I think Holbein was kind of always bubbling away at the back of my mind. Eventually I think it was almost inevitable that I would, return to him. But you're absolutely right. It is going back in time to the early Tudor period. I like your characterization of these 3 books as sort of having a Venn diagram, because I think in many ways each has grown out of the last, unanswered questions. So, for example, when I was writing the book on Dudley,
phone's ringing. What a day. Right, okay.
Might be your brother trying to help us with our technical.
It actually isn't. I tell you who that is. That's Max Wallace of the Aftershock Review, obviously wanting his daily discussion about what we're going to put in the next issue. So later, Max, Oh, right. He'll leave a message. So, sorry, this is real time here. This is real life. This is the literary world,
We didn't make everyone watch the hour it took us to get our...
Yeah. Well, I was hoping you were on day over that. So.
Yes, so when I was writing the book on Robert Dudley's picture collection, I kept thinking, there must have been earlier models at the Tudor court that were influences on him and on his concept of what it meant to be a patron of painters and a collector of paintings. And I thought, people like Thomas Cromwell must have been models in some way for Dudley as a collector, as a patron. And at the time, I remember thinking that it was a shame that there wasn't a book that I could go to find out about people like More and Cromwell as collectors. You could sort of glean clues from passing mentions in various books, but there wasn't really one place to go to for information on that. So one of the strands I've tried to weave through my book on Holbein is the story of how Henry VIII's courtiers kind of fell in love with collecting, painting, commissioning paintings, and tried to tell the story of More, Cromwell, and their contemporaries as early patrons of painters and collectors of paintings. And similarly, when I was writing the book on Nicholas Hilliard, which came out in 2019, Hilliard absolutely idolized Holbein and clearly saw Holbein's career trajectory as a model for his own, in the sense of Holbein having been someone who fixed the appearances of Henry VIII and his leading courtiers for contemporaries and posterity. And Hilliard very much aspired to do the same for Elizabeth I and her leading courtiers. But again, I was struck when I went in search of kind of just basic facts and dates about Holbein's life and career. I was really surprised to realize that the most recent scholarly biography, A.B. Chamberlain's, had been published in 1913, 1914, something like that. So, though absolutely remarkable in its day, not least for its sepia tinted illustrations, which were absolutely cutting edge at the time, obviously, after more than 100 years, it was looking a little bit dated in many respects. So, I think various seeds were planted along the way that maybe the time was ripe for a new look at Holbein, a fresh look at Holbein's life and career, weaving in the story of early patronage, early collecting at the Tudor court. And then when I realized that 2026 would mark the 500th anniversary of Holbein's arrival in England, it just kind of seemed an auspicious moment. And happily, Emily Lees, who was my editor at Yale and the Paul Mellon Center for Hilliard, and also the designer of that book, was very excited at the prospect of doing something on Holbein. Apparently, she has wanted her whole career to find a Holbein project. So it kind of just seemed like fate, stars seemed to be aligning. It was a thrill to work with Emily again. I think an art book could have the best text in the world, but if you haven't got good illustrations on nice quality paper, and if you haven't got someone putting a huge amount of thought into the layout and the design, something is going to be lost. And anyway, it was a real privilege to get to work with Emily Lees again.
I mean, there were issues though, weren't there? I mean, the documentary evidence can be quite scanty, and I was very struck by the way you quite often say, could it be this? Could it be that? We don't know. This is probable, but we'll never be certain. Did these two people meet? Did he go there? It's extremely likely. It doesn't, there's nothing to contradict it, but we do not know. You don't do the, he must have, he must have felt. You don't really do that.
I try to not sort of overstep the mark into he must have, we can be certain that ... because most of the time we can't be certain. So it's a tricky thing trying to lay out all the evidence and be even-handed about what we can and cannot say, but also trying to write it in such a way that it's actually readable. You don't want each sentence so bogged down in qualifications and that it just becomes utterly turgid prose. So each chapter was revised many times to try to keep the to be true to what the evidence does or does not tell us, but also to try to write it in a way that makes the reader want to keep going and makes the reader want to turn the page. So actually with all three books, what I've tried to do is write something that's scholarly and very much rooted in, the archives, but hopefully appeals not just to scholars, hopefully brings in a wider audience, the educated general reader, of which I think there are a lot out there. I think some writers have slightly given up on the idea that there is this educated general reader out there, but I think there are lots of people that fall into that category who want something meaty, but want it to read nicely. And I think it's a hard thing to pull off. And I'm not sure I've done it, but that's what I was going for, certainly with all three books.
I think you've done it. I think you've absolutely nailed it. I mean, it helps that, these characters, they're some of the largest characters living through some of the most exciting and dangerous, like I say, dangerous periods of history. And, it's interesting. I found reading this, thinking about the figure of Henry VIII, whose image, Holbein kind of sealed for us. And he's a different character. I mean, it's not a biography of Henry VIII. So it's more, I mean, you're kind of looking at him as a kind of art expert, connoisseur.
Yes.
And I think it's a really interesting way to look at this man.
Yes, I mean, that's another strand that I tried to weave in, the way in which it seemed to me, and this wasn't something I really thought about before I started working on this book and looking at the primary sources, but it seemed to me that Henry wasn't really interested in painting or portraiture until the mid-1530s. It seemed to me that up until that point, he used architectural patronage, he used court festivals, he used commissioning plate and jewelry, all of those things as ways of telegraphing his magnificence. And obviously painting comes under the heading of court festivals, but that's ephemeral painting. It's almost like a stage prop. It's not something that's meant to hang on the wall of Long Gallery for years to come. And then suddenly in the mid-1530s, which is when Holbein really hits his stride, but it's also a time when Henry is in a pretty desperate state in terms of his image, both in England and on the international stage. And it's as if the penny suddenly drops and he realizes actually painting or painted portraiture certainly is a way of telegraphing your magnificence. It is a way of shaping your identity in the eyes of contemporaries and posterity. And in this, he's in many ways following the lead of some of his leading courtiers like More and Cromwell, who a few years ahead of Henry kind of figured this out for themselves and realized that they can use painting and portraiture more specifically to craft their own images. So it was really fascinating to me to chart that and to see how through inventories in particular you can really document it, that portraiture just takes off during Holbein's time in England, and images of Henry suddenly start being displayed on the walls of his subjects from the late 1530s onwards. But this English obsession with filling the walls of your Long Gallery, if you were lucky enough to have a Long Gallery, with images of the great and the good, it's this quintessential English thing that we kind of think has always been there, but it really is something that is just happening and just kind of coming into its own during the years when Holbein is in England. And to me, that was another fascinating strand of the story to try to bring out, because it didn't seem to me something that had really been looked at in any detail before, and no one had kind of pulled that strand out of the story.
Let's kind of row back just a little bit. Let's look at young Holbein, and when did he start showing that he had this just amazing ability? Because one of the things about the whole book, I believe that he captures these people the way a photographer might. You know, we don't know. We haven't got them. We haven't met Henry VIII, but I absolutely believe that these were miraculous. You know, his skill was absolutely miraculous. When did it start to show, and what was his upbringing?
Well, he was born in Augsburg, which is obviously now in Germany, but was at the time at the heart of the Holy Roman Empire. And his father, also called Hans the Elder, was one of Augsburg's leading sacred painters. And so I think that we don't actually know a great deal with certainty about Holbein the Younger's early years. I think the assumption has to be that he would have grown up observing goings on in his father's workshop, that his initial training in draftsmanship and painting would have been from his father and others in his father's workshop. I think probably the assumption was that he would one day grow up to work alongside his father and perhaps one day take over the Augsburg workshop. Some clues emerge from Hans the Elder's sacred paintings, which often feature his sons. They seem to have acted as models for figures in crowd scenes. And one gets the sense, and I mean, again, you have to be careful not to sort of read too much into these images, but the young Holbein the Younger, pops up a lot as a toddler and small child in his father's sacred paintings. And you do get the sense that here is a child who was A, much loved, and B, seen as very special, having some sort of unusual talent that had been spotted by his father from a young age. In fact, there's one portrait that depicts Holbein the Younger at the age of, I don't know, 6 or 7, which seems to show him in a crowd scene in a sacred painting, holding in his left hand, he was left-handed, what appears to be a sort of modified paintbrush, as if, the father had rigged something up to accommodate the fact that the child was quite tiny and didn't have very big hands or very long arms at this point. So, I mean, who knows quite what that meant, but it's tempting to see that as an indication that the child had perhaps contributed in some way to painting something in the background of that picture. But you definitely get the sense from the frequency with which this young child pops up in his father's paintings that he was seen as someone special and with preternatural talent. And that's kind of a theme that continues. Holbein, as a teenager, ends up leaving Augsburg with his older brother to look for fame and fortune elsewhere. Their father's work as a sacred painter had sort of taken a downturn, in part because of the advent of the Reformation. The brothers end up in Basel in Switzerland, and very quickly Holbein, I'll just call him Holbein now, we don't have to I think the father will drift out of the story, so we don't have to distinguish Holbein the Elder and Holbein the Younger anymore. So anyway, Holbein, as a teenager, very quickly makes his mark in Basel, and again seems to get special treatment. So we find him in 1516. He's not yet a member of the Basel Painters Guild, but he gets this amazing gig to portray the newly elected mayor of Basel in a painted diptych, so paired marital portrait showing the mayor and his wife. And he signs these paintings, which strictly he shouldn't have been allowed to do because he wasn't yet a member of the Basel Painters Guild. But no doubt if the mayor thought it was okay, the guild would have looked the other way. And this is just the first of many instances, not just in Switzerland, but then later in England, when Holbein seems to have been allowed to bend the rules, break the rules, presumably because he was someone who just had talents that others did not have. He had skills that were not easily replaced, and seems just to have often been allowed to pretty much do what he wanted in a way that contemporaries would not have been allowed to do.
And maybe also, even at that stage, people were going, "Oh, but this is a Holbein. This isn't just any old picture. It's by this, this wunderkind, I guess, at the time."
Yes, absolutely. And as his career progresses, one gets fleeting glimpses from the documentary record that he himself came to have a pretty, had a pretty high opinion of himself and may from time to time, particularly after he was given the title of King's Painter to Henry VIII. He may have thrown his weight around a bit to remind people that he had this important, impressive status and was, a servant of the King of England. So there's this wonderful anecdote about him going back to Basel in 1538. So this would have been at the height of his career at Henry VIII's court. And after he had been living in England for some time, though, he had left behind in Basel a wife and several children. And various Basel locals who were eyewitnesses to this 5-week or so visit that he made to Basel describe him swanning about in very grand clothes and just really lording it over everyone. And you do get this sense of someone who was very keen to remind people that he had made it, that he had really succeeded. And who could really argue with that? He was incredibly talented, and against the odds, managed to keep his head at Henry VIII's court. I mean, he had, a succession of patrons, More, Anne Boleyn, Cromwell, who obviously all fell from favor spectacularly, but somehow Holbein was sort of, the Teflon painter. Nothing stuck, he was never by association with any of these patrons who ended up falling out with Henry VIII. Somehow Holbein just kept going.
I mean, I made that comment about, I believe he was great at capturing likenesses, but of course you have this fabulous image on the cover. This is Anne of Cleves, and of course that's quite a contentious episode in his life, but you don't really believe the story that's come down to us. That I
think it's been a little bit exaggerated in the retelling. I mean, I think when I went back to the documentary sources, the original accounts of how Henry responded to both the paintings that Holbein produced, and then also Anne herself in the flesh, he's very critical of his ambassadors and various diplomats on the continent, many of whom he thought were inept, though to be fair, often they were charged with almost impossible tasks by Henry when he was on the search for wife number 4. But I couldn't find any evidence of him specifically criticizing Holbein's paintings of Anne, and there are at least 2. There's the painting in the Louvre that I reproduce on the cover of the book, and then a very, very closely related miniature in the V&A. And I couldn't find any evidence of Henry specifically criticizing Holbein as having portrayed Anne inaccurately. He definitely thought that some of the oral and written reports of ambassadors who had been sent to the continent to form impressions of Anne and other prospective brides, he definitely felt let down by some of those reports. But I think the idea that Holbein was singled out in any way has been greatly exaggerated. I mean, so far as I can tell, Holbein just sailed on basically unscathed by this. I mean, Cromwell was the person who took the fall. He is executed 6 months after Henry and Anne are married, it was, of course, Cromwell who had pushed very hard for that union. But Holbein just sort of sails on. He remains in post as King's Painter, keeps collecting his annual retainer from the crown, continues to produce images for Henry. And indeed, in the last few years of Holbein's life, in the early 1540s, he comes up with 2 new templates for new portraits of Henry. He comes up with templates for new portraits of Prince Edward, the future Edward VI. So, I mean, he really is largely unaffected by the the fall of Cromwell, and by Henry's dissatisfaction with Anne of Cleves.
I mean, the other intriguing thing is whether, presumably, he took paintings of Henry VIII, he painted him from the life. I mean, my mind is blown by the idea of Henry VIII kind of sitting there. And, and another question is, of course, he was German, he spoke German. Would they have needed interpreter? Your Grace, would you kindly, stop moving around?
Exactly. It would be so wonderful to have been able to have been a fly on the wall during these sittings. And I mean, you raised so many good points. I think the language issue is one that I became really fascinated by whilst working on the book, and trying to figure out how Holbein communicated with his various patrons. I mean, presumably he must have acquired a certain amount of English after X number of years living in England. But the fact that on his portrait drawings, which are very much working documents for himself and members of his workshop, the fact that the notes to self on those drawings are in German, even on drawings that were, that can be securely dated to well into his time in England, makes me think that he was never all that at home in English. I mean, clearly he still thought in German, presumably too. He presided over a workshop largely staffed by German emigres or people from the Low Countries who would have spoken a version of Low German that would have meshed with Holbein's sort of dialect. So I'm not sure he was ever all that comfortable with English. So certainly in his early dealings with Thomas More, so scrolling back to the mid 1520s, we know that he used Nicholas Kreutzer as a translator. Kreutzer was a native of Munich and was the king's astronomer and had close ties to More. More preferred to speak to people in Latin if he could. There's no way that Holbein would have possessed good enough Latin. And certainly at that stage he wouldn't have had much English. So we know that Kreutzer, who had excellent Latin and obviously was a native German speaker, was acting as go-between. Who may have acted as go-between with Henry VIII, we don't know. I mean, Cromwell had some German, but often needed to rely on the German merchants of the Steelyard as translators for anything complex. So, I mean, there are a lot of possible options in terms of who might have acted as translator. But yes, to be a fly on the wall and to know what they talked about. I mean, I often think, Holbein and Henry VIII both had such exceptionally complicated domestic lives, because Holbein had, as I mentioned, this family in Basel that he left behind, effectively abandoned, but then he started another family in England, and we don't know if he was ever married to this woman in England who was the mother of at least 2 children. I mean, he may have been. I think bigamy was, more common in those days. Obviously, in a pre-internet era, it was a lot easier to,
Yeah. Who's to know? What happens back in Basel stays in Basel.
Exactly. So, I sometimes think that Holbein and Henry VIII, with so many complicated women in their lives and, would have had all sorts of things to chat about. But yes, we don't actually know how much FaceTime Holbein was granted, with the Whitehall mural image, which is sort of the classic image of Henry VIII.
Sort of like this.
Exactly. The one that come down through the ages and has spawned a million pub signs and a million knickknacks and all sorts. I mean, we know that that full face, staring down the viewer image of Henry was not how it started. So the cartoon in the National Portrait Gallery, which dates from somewhere in the middle of that commission shows Henry looking off to one side as if gazing at Jane Seymour. And then at some point, the plan was changed so that Henry would have a much more aggressive, full-face stance. And we don't know how far into the commission that change was made. We don't know if the change was made, did Holbein suggest it? Did the king demand it? Cromwell, who I'm sure was very much involved in midwifing this commission, did he suggest it? We just don't know, but it's it's absolutely fascinating. And similarly, we don't know if, in order to make that change from the glancing to one side pose to the full face pose, would a new set of sittings have been required, or would Holbein have just been able to kind of tweak things from whatever face time he had been granted up to that point? It's difficult to know. Sorry, I'm losing the natural light. Let me just try turning it on. Is that too bright?
That's better. No, that's better, actually. I was going to suggest.
Yeah, yeah.
As you know, we started this a bit later than we thought we were going to start, so it is. We're getting into wintry darkness now. I mean, I was really fascinated to see one thing as I was going through and looking at these amazing images of long dead people, and I thought, what a shame he never got round to doing Anne Boleyn, but he did. There is a drawing.
I think so. I mean, there has been some debate historically about whether the drawing, which is inscribed with Anne Boleyn's name as the sitter, whether it really does depict her. My feeling is that it does, and that seems to mesh with the current scholarly consensus. But those identifications, which appear on the Holbein drawings now in the Royal Collection, were added mainly in the 18th century with recourse to a list that was drawn up in the 1550s, so not long after Holbein died. And the vast majority of those identifications are accurate. There are a handful that are unambiguously wrong, but those tend to be identifications of minor court figures. You can sort of understand why there might have been a mix-up. So, for example, I think on drawings of two of Thomas More's daughters, the identifications are wrong, but you can sort of understand how there could be a mix-up there. Whereas I think it's just very unlikely that someone compiling a list in the 1550s would have been confused about what Anne Boleyn looked like, particularly given that the person who was compiling the list is someone who knew the Boleyn family personally. So I think, yes, I think that drawing in the Royal Collection is indeed a depiction of Anne Boleyn. And it would be very surprising, given that we know what a learned, cultured person Anne was and what a great love she had of the visual arts. It would be surprising if she hadn't sat to Holbein, if she hadn't commissioned a portrait. And one of the things I love about that drawing, and you can't really see it in reproduction, but in the flesh with a magnifying glass, there is so she's looking down, she's sort of gazing down. And
she's got this weird double chin. I mean, it's not very attractive, it has to be said.
And I think possibly one of the reasons some people in the past have been reluctant to accept that could be an image of Anne is that she, yes, as you say, it isn't the most attractive image. I think some people have a very romanticized notion of what Anne Boleyn should look like, and that drawing possibly doesn't tick all the boxes. But anyway, in the flesh with the magnifying glass, there is very faintly sketched in the margin what appears to be an open book. And Holbein would often sort of sketch as aide-memoire to himself in the margins of these portrait sketches, which are mainly just head and shoulders and focusing on the facial features. But he would sometimes sketch in the margin a prop as a sort of reminder to himself of what he was going to include in the finished painting, which normally showed the hands. So I like to think that possibly, she was reading while sitting to him, and possibly the finished painting, which does not survive, and we don't know, would it have been an oil painting, would it have been a portrait miniature, we just don't know, or it could have been both, might have shown her reading. Obviously she was, that would be very consistent with everything we know about Anne as a very learned woman of letters.
I also wondered whether, one of the things that Holbein had to do was churn out, is probably the wrong word, but generate images.
Absolutely.
It was tremendously important, and but with somebody like Anne, she fell out of favour so quickly. Maybe there just wasn't time.
It's absolutely. I think that's an excellent point. Yes, it may be. Yes, that he did that preliminary study and then never had an opportunity to work it up into any paintings. We don't know exactly when during her reign he did that drawing, but yes, if it was too late in the game, it may, events may have just overtaken the commission. Equally, if it did give rise to oil portraits, any sensible person that was worried about self-preservation would have whipped that portrait off the wall the minute Anne fell from favor and thrown it on the fire. And I think something similar certainly would have happened with portraits of More, portraits of John Fisher, portraits of Cromwell. It's pretty clear. This was one of the really exciting discoveries that I made when I looked again at the documentary sources from the period. It's very clear that people like More and Cromwell were ordering multiple versions of their portrait from Holbein, so that the famous paintings of More and Cromwell that we all know in the Frick, there would have been many more versions of those circulating in the 1520s and 1530s. But I'm sure that the minute each of those men fell from favor, people who had proudly displayed their portraits when they were, very much at the height of their power, would have taken those down very quickly and, done everything they could to disavow their former loyalty to More and to Cromwell. So, yes, there's an interesting question about what survives relative to the amount of work that Holbein actually produced. And I think that what survives is probably just the tip of the iceberg. I think a huge amount has been lost and destroyed over time, not just with the portraits, but also with sacred painting. Had it not been for the Reformation, I think Holbein, I think he started off wanting to be a sacred painter, thinking he would follow in his father's footsteps. And portraiture was something he kind of fell into when the opportunities for sacred painting started to dry up. And I suspect early on in his time in England, so during his first visit of the 1520s, when England was still very much a Catholic country, he may well have done a great deal of sacred painting, particularly given that Thomas More was his chief patron at the time. But I suspect that successive waves of iconoclasm, particularly during the reign of Edward VI, will have destroyed any evidence or most of the evidence of that. And of course, a great deal of the religious painting that we know that he did in Switzerland was destroyed during Basil's iconoclastic riots of Shrove Tuesday 1529, this extraordinary occurrence when the normally very law-abiding burghers of Basel took to the streets and in 24 hours basically set fire to and smashed up all of the city's sacred imagery. A few bits and bobs were saved. And actually, all things considered, a remarkable number of Holbein's sacred paintings have survived from that period in Basel, largely because they were in private chapels, so beyond the easy reach of the mob. But there's a Last Supper, which you can see on display in the Kunstmuseum in Basel, which was rescued from the pyre at the last moment, but you can still see today these incredible gashes in it from, a sledgehammer or some heavy object. Someone had tried to hack it to pieces, and then had thrown it on a pyre, and obviously someone else then whisked it away at the last moment. But it's very powerful looking at that painting in Basel now, and I can see why they haven't fully restored it, because it's so interesting to see those marks. But yes, I mean, I'm sure that what survives in terms of the sacred painting is just the tip of the iceberg in terms of what Holbein actually produced.
Did your researches for this take you to intriguing places, like into private collections or into things that are not on display?
It did. That was one of the great joys of this book, getting to go behind the scenes in all sorts of wonderful places. So the Royal Collection in England has one of the largest collections of works by Holbein, and the drawings and the miniatures are, because they're light sensitive and basically need to be stored in the dark most of the time, can be viewed by appointment by scholars in the Royal Library at Windsor Castle. And I'm so grateful to the curators at the Royal Collection who let me come day after day after day for weeks on end to look at these extraordinary drawings and the miniatures. And the drawings really are the kind of thing which just repay time spent looking at them. I mean, you can just spend hours looking at each portrait drawing, and the more you look, the more you start to notice, and the more you start to kind of get into Holbein's mindset and start to understand sort of how he thought, and the types of notes to self that he would make, and the types of marginal jottings that he would make as sort of aide-memoirs. I was talking about reminders of props he might want to incorporate, and then you also sort of start to see points of connection between drawings, particularly when that particular drawings were executed at about the same time, overlapping commissions. So that was fascinating. It was wonderful as well at Windsor Castle to get to see the oil portraits by Holbein, which are on display in the state apartments, which are, of course, open to the public. But I was allowed to go during times when the apartments weren't open to the public, so that I could get up close, and they brought me a ladder and a torch, because the paintings are hung very high, 18th century style, right up to the ceiling, and very high ceilings. So, it was really fun climbing up a ladder with my torch and just having a close look. They let me visit, I think it's called Windsor Home Park, or anyway, there's a sort of farmhouse on the Windsor estate where all the conservation takes place, and where they have all the files. So that was great fun, getting to go into the conservation studio and looking at files of Holbein's that have been conserved, and the conservators very kindly talked to me through the files. So that was a great joy. The Met let me go into their storage facilities in the basement. There's this incredible tunnel system basically under Fifth Avenue, and they've just got all sorts of treasures in storage. So that was great fun. So there were a lot of kind of pinch me moments like that, where I just thought, I can't believe I get to do this, and everyone was just so accommodating. But I think Holbein is one of those artists that just curators, private collectors, the people who are entrusted with caring for his works are just I think Holbein's works inspire a real love and loyalty on the part of those who are lucky enough to get to look after them, and certainly I was a beneficiary of a great deal of generosity from curators and private collectors. And it was also a great stroke of luck that the years during which I was working on this book, so I started working on it in 2019, right after my Hilliard book came out, and obviously lockdown intervened, but there were also completely by chance, I didn't know this when I embarked on the project, a number of exhibitions that were either Holbein-centric or Holbein-adjacent, which meant that there were opportunities to see works by Holbein gathered together in one place in a way that you wouldn't normally have the opportunity. So the Met had its wonderful Tudor show, which had a huge number of Holbeins, not just from the Met's own collection, but borrowed from all over the world. And there have been exhibitions in Frankfurt and in Augsburg itself, and the Royal Collection had a Holbein retrospective. So it's been a really wonderfully rich period in terms of works by Holbein being on display, and often works being juxtaposed, being hung side by side in a way that they normally wouldn't be. So that greatly enriched my thinking, and was a real stroke of luck for me, and also meant that certain works which it might have been difficult for me to see in the flesh, because they were brought together to the Met or to the Städel in Frankfurt or wherever. My task was made that little bit easier, in that, I wasn't having to make quite so many trips, and, it just became a bit more feasible to see a substantial, portion of his surviving works.
As we've said, some things did not survive. Is there something that you wish could magically reappear or be restored or be found or not have been destroyed?
Oh gosh, that is
what
such.
Would that be?
Well, I think going back to Anne Boleyn, whose portrait drawing we were talking about a few minutes ago. I mean, if that did give rise to painted portraits, whether in oils on wood or in miniature, watercolor on vellum, that would be a very exciting thing to see. I think that would be absolutely thrilling. And if the Whitehall mural itself survived,
that's the one destroyed in a fire, is that right?
Exactly. Yeah. So we have a pretty good idea of what it looked like, because about 10 years before it was destroyed by fire, by chance it was copied, but on a much smaller scale. So whereas we know the original mural was vast, and apparently Henry was so huge in it that to stand before him was to feel annihilated in his presence, the copy was not done to scale, so you don't get that sense of annihilation when you look at it, but at least it tells us, we sort of know what the composition was, we know what the inscriptions were, and so between that and eyewitness descriptions and the cartoon that I mentioned, which is only a fragment, but nonetheless shows us what Henry VIII and a little bit of what Henry VII looked like. You can kind of piece it together, but you are having to use your imagination to a certain extent when trying to visualize the Whitehall murals. So yes, if only that had survived, that would be pretty exciting.
Fantastic. Well, we've had a wonderful conversation. I'm going to go to the three questions now that I ask everybody at the end. So we have been talking, I mean, I've put the other books down. They're too heavy to wave around, all of them. But, the amazing Robert Dudley book, the book on Hilliard, and then Holbein, there it is in all its absolute gorgeousness, published by Yale. So they're about every 5 years, aren't they, these books of yours?
So, I mean, I think Holbein took a little bit longer, with lockdown in the middle, that, certain things had to be put on hold. Though it was very, we are so lucky nowadays that so many museums have such incredible high-res images and quite a lot of detailed information about provenance and so on available online. So, I was able to access a surprising amount of information about assorted paintings online during lockdown. But yes, the Holbein book took a little bit longer than the had done.
But, as you say, there hasn't been anything comparable for about 100 years. So I think it will last for scholars and general readers and people who are just interested in the Tudor period, because the Tudor period is the period, isn't it? So many people are fascinated by it, and this is a kind of way in, a really intriguing look from somebody who was an outsider who rose to this kind of prominence and just had eyes to see.
Absolutely. Yes, I know that's a really, really good way of putting it. And I think, thanks in large part to Hilary Mantel and Wolf Hall, I think there is just this real appetite now to know more about the Tudors, to know kind of what's the real story behind her amazing fictional trilogy. I met a lovely, sorry, I don't know how to turn off that dinging, but hopefully but I met a lovely woman at a book signing recently in London, who was telling me that she had never heard of Holbein before she read Hilary Mantel's books, and she loved Hans, the character, and then that inspired her to go to the National Gallery to see some examples of his paintings, and she was now obsessed with Holbein, and I just thought that was a really lovely story, and I'm sure she's not alone in that. I mean, I'm sure Hilary Mantel's books have introduced a lot of people to Holbein, and it's just great that there is so much interest in the Tudors. It's an endlessly fascinating period, at least I think so.
Absolutely. Okay, so I'm going to ask you for your favourite artwork. Now, you are an art historian, and the reason I ask about artworks is that I found you can't ask writers for a favourite book. That, it's too hard a question, but I mean, you're in the business of art. This does not need to be a Holbein, but yes, do you have a favorite-ish artwork, should we say?
I think I would actually pick a Holbein. I mean, I Christina of Denmark, as I mentioned at the beginning, was the subject of my first art historical publication back in 2002. And so I think partly for purely sentimental reasons, it has a special place in my heart. But I also just think it's a fascinating picture because it's unusual in that a huge amount of, or relatively huge amount of, documentary evidence survives relating to its commission. And so we know that Holbein went to Brussels to see Christina in the flesh. So we know that he had 3 hours with her on a single afternoon. And I just think it's so extraordinary to think that in the space of 3 hours, he was able to get enough information. Presumably he made multiple drawings, which he then took back to London and worked up into that amazing life-sized full-length painting. But I just find it so fascinating, that whole story, the idea that he could capture so much based on just a 3-hour audience with this sitter. But I think a close second would be The Ambassadors, which Bender Grosvenor, I did his podcast recently, and we were chatting about The Ambassadors, and he, I think, described it as the ultimate art historical rabbit hole. And he's absolutely right. There, it's just endlessly fascinating in terms of the scope for speculation about the possible significance of the many props included in the painting, and just another amazingly large work. Both Christina and The Ambassadors are huge, but one of the things that was so interesting to me when I was traveling around the world looking at Holbein's in person is how those are outliers, at least amongst what survives, because the vast majority of the surviving paintings, well, particularly the portraits, are really remarkably compact. They were designed, I think, to be sent all over Europe and to be easily transportable. So yes, I think Christina and The Ambassadors are just phenomenal for that, sort of jaw-dropping, they're just so monumental. So yes, if I'm allowed to have two, I would.
You are allowed to have two, and I love the Christina portrait. And again, Henry thought, "Oh, I like the look of her," so she had a lucky escape.
Yeah.
But you make the point that it was also intended to show her figure, her stature,
Well, I think so. I mean, that wasn't something that had been brought out in any of the scholarship I had read on Christina. But when I was looking at all of the court correspondence concerning the marriage negotiations, her height kept coming up. The ambassadors who met her were quite, unnerved by just how tall she was. They didn't like the fact that she towered over them. And I think, Holbein realized that his remit was to come up with an accurate portrayal for Henry. And Holbein, surely, I imagine, would have been aware that Henry had said after Jane Seymour's death that being a big man, he needed wife number 4 to be a big lady. So, I think Holbein probably realized that the ambassadors may have been unnerved by Christina's height because she towered over them. Henry probably would have seen it as a bonus, a tick in the plus column that, she was, probably about 5'9", I would guess, and he seems to have been about 6'1". So, I'm sure that's why it's full length. It's the only extant painting of a female sitter by Holbein that's full length, and everything about it really emphasizes the verticality and that sense of height, because the panel is unusually narrow, and then you've got this vertical shadow that runs the length of the right hand side. So the eye is being encouraged to see her as this tall figure. So I'm sure that's not accidental on Holbein's part.
Yeah, it's an absolutely wonderful work. So my book of shame, as I've said in the past, is Wolf Hall and the historical novels of Hilary Mantel, which I'll get round to them, but that's my book of shame. But I would be very surprised if that was your book of shame.
It's not my book of shame, but you're going to be so appalled by my book of shame. Everyone is I've never read War and Peace, and it's so often in conversation, and people are always astounded that I haven't read it, and I've just got to do it. And I think this might be the time of year to do it. It's freezing and, well, it's dark at 4 in the afternoon. So I think this might be a good time of year to just sort of hunker down where it's warm with a nice thick book. So
I only read it myself a few years ago. It took me a long time to get round to it.
But it's just shocking how frequently people in the last year or two, it just dinner parties, drinks parties, it just comes up again and again and again. And so many people whose opinions I really respect, it's their favorite novel. And so I'm clearly missing out. So I've, got to.
Right. Well, we might hold you to that, Elizabeth. We might see how you get on with War and Peace. And finally, what is the funniest or most bizarre feedback you've ever had on your books or your work generally, or articles or anything?
I don't know if this counts as feedback exactly, but it is sort of a funny story, which is that when my book on Robert Dudley was published in 2014, and that was my first solo authored book, and I dedicated it to my husband and to our daughter, who at the time was 6, and I was signing copies, and there was a bit of a queue building up, and my daughter, who was meant to be entertaining herself, was getting a little bit bored and came over and said, "Mommy, can I help?" And I said, "Oh, that's so sweet, but no, I've really got to do this myself." She was just learning joined up writing at school, and she said, but I could sign some. And I said, "Oh, that's really kind, but no, I've got to do it because, it's my name on the title page." And I thought I had successfully fobbed her off with that, and she wandered off. And then she came back a few minutes later, because you know what 6-year-olds are like. They get a bee in their bonnet, and there's no dissuading them. And she said, but my name's in there too. And she turned said, "I could sign that page." And I thought, great, now what am I going to do? So anyway, fortunately, a good friend who happened to be at the back of the queue sort of piped up and said, "Oh, Isabel, please come sign mine." And that distracted her. But the lovely thing is that I have dedicated the Hilliard and Holbein books also to my husband and our daughter, who's now almost 18. And this same friend, very sweetly, with each book has asked her to sign his dedication page. So he's got the whole set, but with the unique autographs. Yes, it's become a bit of a running joke. But yeah, that's
well.
nice.
The serious question is: does she read the books that are dedicated to her?
You have to ask her that. I suspect the answer might be no. Perhaps one day she will.
That is also a form of feedback. But
it is, yes.
But I remember, this is years ago, I was talking to the son of a novelist. And he'd got to the age where he could read his mum's books. If he was younger, they'd be a bit too adult. But I said, do you read them? And he said something along the lines of, look, I get enough of her as it is. I don't need to read the novels as well.
I have a feeling if you ask my daughter, I have a similar response. And you're right, that is feedback of a sort.
That just seemed like the ultimate child of a writer, I feel that's probably a sentiment shared by many. So very funny.
And I have to say, has definitely earned his status as a dedicatee. He has read so many drafts of every chapter of every book, way more than anyone should be called upon to do. So he certainly has earned his place on the dedication page.
Well, between you, you've done a great job. So, talking about Holbein, absolutely marvellous book. I don't want to call it a coffee table book because it's a proper work of scholarship, but a really good read, and just it's been so fabulously published. So I'm going to say sort of goodbye to you. Hang on a moment, but I am going to boot you out of the book bag. But we'll chat later. And I'm now going to say, yes, I mean, what more can I say? We have gone through the Tudor period, talked about some of the most amazing and truly iconic, I don't like to use that term lightly, images. It's a fantastic story, and we get the sense of this extraordinary man who manages to live through these dangerous times, bizarre times, become close to somebody like Henry VIII and get away with it, and create some. What he has done for English history, British history, is really remarkable for a little lad from Swabia in the Holy Roman Empire. I hope you have enjoyed this chat. I recommend the book very much, Holbein by Elizabeth Goldring, and I will see you next time in the book bag with another wonderful writer. So thank you very much for watching, and like and subscribe. Don't forget that. Thank you. Bye-bye.